He's somebody who looks beyond the systems of the body to think about veterans in a much broader context of public health. And that's really key to where we're going today. So I want to say a few words to kind of set up the talk. A lot's been said about Veterans Day, the celebrated each year in commemoration of the end of World War I, Armistice Day, or as it's known throughout the British Commonwealth as Remembrance Day. The war ended on the 11th, at the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month. Although I've often worried how many people died for that poetry. If they knew they were going to end it, perhaps they could have ended it when they decided it was time to end. Regardless, if you think back to 100 years ago, and it was just barely more than that, the First World War ended. In those days, people thought about mental health and the problems of returning soldiers, really in terms of their brain. Shell shock was a brain disease, maybe a spine disease. Nobody was quite sure. There were a lot of arguments. And it was really the aftermath of World War I and really confronting the mental health burden that so many veterans and then their families and communities came to face, that people began to look beyond the brain or parts of the brain and start to think about shell shock in terms of veterans and their thoughts, their minds, their lives. And that turned out to be a powerful way to understand and then to try to help. But a century later, the pendulum swung back again, and we are now a very biological society, looking for things like PTSD in parts of the brain, the amygdala, the hippocampus, the stellate ganglion out in the peripheral nervous system, autonomic nervous system. And we're having a lot of trouble kind of coming back to the question of whether the problems veterans and their families and their communities face in the aftermath of a war, of deployment, might have a lot to do with their thoughts, their lives, their minds. And we'll add to that their relationships with their families, their friends, their jobs, their housing and financial security. And that's really where our panel is going today. And we're very lucky to have an outstanding panel, including some old friends to the Governor's Working Group. So I'd like to welcome our speakers, and I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves, but I'll simply say we have with us Nicole French, no stranger to anyone, I think, on this call, Dr. Nicole French of Veterans Bridge Home down in Charlotte, but with arms reaching in many directions. Jason Nieuwsma, one of my colleagues through the VA's Mid-Atlantic Mental Illness Research Education and Clinical Center, the MIRECC, and Jason has helped build an important program that integrates mental health and as well as spiritual health and works closely with the Divinity School. And Joe Hazel of the Veterans Life Center. And you couldn't have a better named program, I think, than the Veterans Life Center, not the Veterans Amygdala Center, but the Veterans Life Center, doing wonderful work. And it's taken years to get there. Here we are. So I won't make this introduction last any longer. Nicole, I'll turn the floor over to you for your opening comments. And if you would also say a little bit about yourself just to get the ball rolling. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kudler. I'm delighted to be with you this afternoon. I'm an Army clinical psychologist, Army veteran, still currently serving in the reserves. I serve as the clinical director at Veterans Bridge Home, and I've been invited to speak for just a few minutes about the effects of trauma. And so I hope that this frame will just invite you to learn more as we learn together to take care of the military and veterans in our state and in our country. I have some slides. I don't know if they are going to come up. Excellent, thank you. I really want to focus on one particular study that's been revolutionary in helping us understand the long-lasting effects of childhood trauma on the body and health and well-being. We certainly have more research and information on trauma than we've ever had. And I want to leave you with a message of hope. And in this virtual room with hundreds of people really who care about the health and well-being of service members, veterans, and families and want to give back, research tells us that the way you show up with empathy and compassion can mitigate the effects of trauma stemming from parents who are unable really to offer the kind of love and care their children needed. And to the health and human service providers in this virtual room, when you prioritize your own well-being and can offer empathy and compassion in the delivery of needed services across social determinants of health, you help your clients heal wounds created from parental abuse and neglect or inconsistent attunement from a primary caregiver. So on this first slide, I share images that Dan Siegel and Tina Bryson used in their book called The Power of Showing Up. I want you to bring your attention to the brain right there in the middle, which they have really used a house to portray the different parts of the brain. So you've got the downstairs brain that represents really the survival system that's online from the womb. And then you've got, really you've got the prefrontal cortex here, which is the upstairs part of the brain and these capacities of thinking and planning and imagining come online over time, and really like 25 years. It takes for the prefrontal cortex to be fully myelinated and for insight and judgment to be developed. And then the stairs that connect really the downstairs brain and the upstairs brain is that amygdala, that emotional brain that has already even been referenced. And so, there's just so much power in understanding that experience shapes our brain, that we are lifelong learners as long as our brain is not compromised. And so I start there to give you kind of a framework. A healthy mind, which is really that flow of energy and information between the different parts of the brain and the body and relationship, is represented and characterized by flexibility and adaptability, coherent, energized, and stable system. And that's what we're really after. The mind is relational, so you can see those key components of any secure functioning relationship: being safe, being seen, being soothed, and being secure. Those components are super important in the developing mind between a primary caregiver and an infant, but we know that they're really important in adult relationships too. So Siegel and Bryson bring our attention to the components of really optimal like mind development and child development, which is number one, a parent being able to pause and reflect on his or her own parenting experience. If they do that, they're going to have the ability to show up and be the kind of parent, or practice learning, being the kind of parent they want to be, regardless of how they were parented. Showing up and two primary tasks are keeping our kids safe. And what does that mean? Protecting them from harm, but also not being a source of terror. By utilizing those 4 S's in relationship with their child creates a secure attachment through which the mind and brain will continue to develop. So that is the framework of hope and really that I come from. The second slide, I'm going to get into the adverse childhood experience study, which really happened in the mid-90s. And there's been a lot of further study, and you can find a lot of great research on the CDC website, and there's lots of information out there. But really, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study is a landmark study because it really focused on how well we found out how commonplace 10 categories of adverse child experiences actually are in the population. So this study occurred at Kaiser Permanente. Over 15,000 patients were surveyed. They started with just looking at 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences, and you can see them here, and they're bucketed into buckets of abuse, neglect, or household dysfunction. These categories certainly don't encompass all undesirable experiences that children face, like a parent with PTSD or a mother with postpartum depression, just to name a few. But what we learned is that a cumulative ACE score can lead to lasting negative effects throughout the lifespan. Now, that's assuming there's no intervention. So a score of 0 means that a person reported no experiences in any of these categories. If she were to report, let's say, childhood sexual abuse, exposure to domestic violence, and emotional neglect, she would get a score of 3. So the scores reveal kind of what researchers call the cumulative biologic effect of childhood stressors. So a person's score correlates really with the way their brain and body function. So the next slide shows how our survival system is really triggered by an increase of arousal in the body. So I'm wondering if that next slide really shows how the survival system is hardwired. We're hardwired to self-protect in the face of danger through a process called neuroception. So like the cells of our body recognize threat, and the brain responds by increasing neurochemicals that help us mobilize to act and respond through fight or flight, or to freeze and faint to increase chances of survival. Really, I love the polyvagal theory really helps us understand how our brain has evolved and adapt to respond to relationships. So the green part of this slide really represents the power of social engagement on the nervous system. So as when a child comes into the world, the child is when the child learns how to engage with the mother, the eye gaze, the tone of voice, all of that sends signals of safety in the child's nervous system. Each of us has a nervous system that responds to these social cues, and you can think about a person with whom you feel safe and think about those factors that actually help you be at ease or know you're at ease with this other person. But this is really what's really important to understand about trauma is it impacts the whole nervous system. And so part of healing trauma is understanding how do we deal with this increased arousal in our system. And I like how this slide kind of looks at really some of the thought patterns that can happen. For example, in that fight or flight mode, our arousal goes up and we either fight or we flee. We don't have to think about that. The upstairs brain, the thinking, analyzing part of our brain isn't needed to run from that bear in the woods. And thank goodness it's not. And then with higher arousal, we actually may go into a freeze or faint state when everything shuts down for survival. And this is going to, literally activities it's going to be difficult for that person to do activities of normal living. Eye contact, social engagement is almost going to be impossible in this state. The next slide really helps us. Harvard has helped us understand different types of stress, like positive stress. Increases in arousal is necessary for learning, for growth. However, when we don't have enough supports and you've got that tolerable and toxic, that's going to be individual specific in some ways. But tolerable stress is when we have enough support, our system can handle it and metabolize that stress. Toxic ranges are going to be without the support that is needed, or for prolonged periods, we stay in that yellow and red zone. So the ACEs study helps us really, the previous slide, gives you understanding of how even trauma and addiction show up together. So human beings dealing with high levels of arousal in the system are looking for relief. They're trying to make the arousal tolerable. So they are going to be more prone to these behaviors. And that's what this study really actually helped us understand, that there is a correlation with these adverse childhood experiences and people who are trying to, or people who are using drugs or using alcohol or smoking. And we can really understand that makes a lot of sense in understanding trauma better. Also, ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, heart disease, mental illness, depression, and substance abuse problems throughout the lifespan. The next slide, really the ACEs study helped us understand that the negative effects on social, emotional, and cognitive development can be traced back to high ACE scores. And can lead to early death. ACEs are high ACE scores negatively impact education and learning, job performance and opportunities, and even earning potential. One thing to note is that limitations really of this study, like it didn't look at how children who received intervention or parental support learned to overcome these experiences. The study did not look at the impact of positive childhood experiences either. And for more, The Deepest Well by Nadine Harris, she has a great TED Talk also, can really give insight into what kinds of intervention works. We know intervention works. And, but the next slide, I just want to highlight, the importance of understanding how this ACE study can really help us address and prevent some of the most complex social problems. And we are in a room full of community providers across social determinants of health. And the more health and human service providers, the more employers, the more, community members understand trauma and have a trauma-informed kind of lens, the more they're going to actually be able to leverage their own system to create interventions that work. And they can also understand what behaviors may actually create reactivity or emerging kind of from trauma, right? So the more we understand, the more we can show up in ways that are going to promote healing in the clients we desperately want to serve. The next slide brings attention to CDC's guidance, best practices for preventing ACEs. And we are doing this in North Carolina. Like, we have so many wonderful interventions available for trauma. And I want to bring attention to that last bullet. And what is the most important intervention or antidote to an adverse childhood experience? It really is a secure relationship. It's a secure attachment. How do we do that? We do that in relationship. So I invite you to think about your own family, the people you serve, the people you care about. How do we be courageous and ask for help and the right kind of help in a timely manner? What we know is that abuse and neglect and domestic violence have long-standing effects. I really do invite you to get help and invite people to get help. Something is really wrong in a parent who's really even hardwired to protect their offspring when they become the terror themselves. And when empathy and compassion are compromised. And that's what happens with trauma. What we've learned about domestic violence in the home, for example, a baby who is sleeping and can hear parents who are arguing, so screaming, even if the baby is sleeping, we have learned that there are increases in really neural responses across parts of the brain that deal with emotion and stress reactivity and regulation. So may we be aware that this type of exposure is harmful for neurodevelopment, and we're going to have the most opportunity to intervene in our own circles. And may we invite ourselves to pay attention to the supports we need. Another area of attention is really protecting children from realities they're just not developmentally prepared for. So, movies, video games, photographs, social media, sexual content that they may not be ready for. These are all areas of opportunities. Next slide. I am proud to be a part of a North Carolina statewide effort to reduce suicide with an upstream approach, making as many connections across social determinants of health as early as possible. We are training in our own organizations, in our social enrichment opportunities, like Veterans Day is right around the corner. Where are you volunteering? Who are you getting to know? How are you inviting someone to actually connect to other military and veteran communities? And then, do you know the partners in this community to which you can refer? Trusted partners, because there's a transfer of trust. The next slide will show you that we are a teams approach. We are organized in these buckets of, and we know each other. And that's how we can make connections even more quickly. The next slide. This is just the beginning, short comments, but I invite you to learn more. I invite you to be a part of the Battle Buddy tribe. You can sign up on our website. You can take the Governor's Challenge training. It's just 1 hour. It's the start of lifelong learning and understanding how we can, number one, show up for ourselves and our families and our community. Next slide. I think the rest of the slides are just supportive resources for you. My contact information is at the end, and I have references for some of the material I shared. I am going to pass it back off to Dr. Kudler. Thank you so much.
Nicole, thank you. That was a wonderful crosswalk between brain and mind and families and communities. And especially, I think your emphasis on what we're now coming to call social prescribing, the opportunity when there is someone who's been in a tough spot in life and maybe faced a lot of adverse childhood events or risk for doing so, or their families who want to prevent that, can reach out to people like the members of the governor's work group who can help in so many ways, strengthen housing and jobs and finances and protect kids and their families. That was really terrific. Thank you. Well, let's go forward then to Dr. Jason Nieuwsma of the VA Mid-Atlantic MIRECC. Jason, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Kudler and Dr. French. I really appreciate that term you just used, Harold, social prescribing. I haven't heard that before. It's something that an old colleague of yours, Dr. Keith Metter, who I've worked with for many years as part of the work in our integrative mental health program in VA, has many times said, I wish I could write somebody a prescription for community, but there's just not a prescription for that. Maybe, like you say, Dr. Kudler, maybe that's the work of this governor's work group. And I will say I so appreciate psychiatrists. As a psychologist myself, I appreciate psychiatrists like yourself, like Dr. Metter, who want to say, yes, great, it's great. Let's do the brain research. Let's look into the medication, but let's not forget the importance of these psychosocial interventions and things to focus on. So as I just mentioned, I am a clinical psychologist with the Department of Veterans Affairs, specifically with the VA's Integrative Mental Health Program, also at Duke University. I've been with VA for a little over 13 years, much of that time with this Integrative Mental Health Program, where a lot of the work that we've done has focused very heavily on integrating mental health and chaplain services, both within VA as well as in the military context. And one of the things that is kind of very much at this intersection of psychological care or mental health care and spiritual care is moral injury. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about how moral injury can be part of this conversation around social determinants of suicide and suicide prevention. So the slide you're seeing here is a model, or maybe kind of a metaphor that our program has been using for a number of years in trying to think about this issue of suicide and suicide prevention, of course, being a very high priority topic within the Department of Veterans Affairs. And from a public health perspective, Dr. Kudler, you mentioned that Mr. Cruz has that MPH in public health. From a public health perspective, we can think about prevention using these terms of primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention. And as we think about those different levels of prevention, they apply to larger or smaller contingencies of a community. And this can be really applied to, thinking about any kind of disease or disorder or condition. So primary prevention is something that applies to everybody. We can engage in primary prevention for anyone. Secondary prevention is prevention efforts that are focused on individuals that are at risk for some kind of condition. And then tertiary prevention is almost really more intervention with individuals who are more actively experiencing a certain problem. So what you see on this slide here are just some of the issues and topics that could fall into these buckets with respect to suicide prevention. And you can see I've circled moral injury on this slide and placed it in that domain of secondary prevention. So things that would place someone at risk for suicide or suicidality. And we know that moral injury from the research is one of those things that can place individuals at higher risk for suicidality. Next slide. So what is moral injury? I imagine that some of the folks on this call have heard of it before. Perhaps others of you have not. I appreciate, Harold, you often bring so much perspective when you talk about any kind of topic, and we've got to go back 100 years and talk about the history of mental health and care of veterans and those kind of things. And I think that's very appropriate as we consider this topic of moral injury. The experience of moral injury is not new. We can trace this back through all recorded conflicts in human history, quite frankly. The construct, as we are studying it within mental health and as it applies to veterans, is fairly new, has been around for a decade or so. And as I mentioned, is something that we've paid quite a bit of attention to within the work that our program does. A couple definitions here. As I just said, moral injury is a newer construct, so there's not just one definition out there. These are kind of distillations of the two most prominent definitions. The first coming from the work of a psychiatrist by the name of Jonathan Shea, who developed that first definition you see there from a lot of work that he did over the years with Vietnam veterans. So moral injury from Shea's perspective is the consequences, really, of feeling betrayed by a leader at a critical moment or in a high stakes situation. And with our Vietnam era veterans, we can think of a range of different ways that that may apply for veterans of that era, whether it was their immediate commanding officer, all the way back to leadership within the United States, all the way up to a societal level within the U.S. when we think about the ways that Vietnam veterans were often treated when they came home. So this feeling of betrayal by leadership, however that's construed, at a critical moment or in a high stakes situation. A more recent definition that's been advanced by psychologist Brett Litz and a number of his colleagues is on the bottom part of this slide. And that's defining moral injury as the consequences of seeing, doing, or failing to stop something that you think is morally wrong. An important piece here, really with both of these definitions, is that morality and the sense that something is right or is wrong is very subjectively determined. It's determined by the individual. It's determined from your perspective as to whether something is morally wrong. Go ahead to the next slide. So the research in this area, some of it has focused explicitly on moral injury. Some of the other research that I've included on this slide includes literature and research that is kind of pointed toward moral injury, even if it hasn't labeled the experience as such. You'll see that I have some data on this slide from veterans in different areas. As I just noted, this experience of moral injury is really something that transcends any given era of service. That first bullet there is looking at research that Kent Drescher and colleagues did in a sample of Vietnam veterans who were in treatment for PTSD. So Vietnam veterans who were in PTSD treatment. And what they found was that nearly 60% of these veterans reported abandoning their religious faith during the war, and that nearly 80% reported having their beliefs challenged by war zone events. So having your faith challenged or your religious beliefs challenged isn't exactly the same as moral injury, but of course, for many individuals, morality, spirituality, religion, religiosity, these things are closely related. And so I think those findings very much point to some of the moral challenges that many Vietnam veterans in this study were experiencing. In work that our group has done through the Vision 6 MIRECC, we looked at a sample of a little over 600 post 9/11 combat veterans, and we found that nearly half of them reported seeing, doing, or failing to stop something that they perceived as morally wrong. To break that down a little bit more, around 1 in 7 of the veterans in this sample reported doing something that they felt like was morally wrong. Around 1 in 5 reported that they failed to stop something that they felt like was morally wrong. And around 2 out of every 5 veterans in this sample said that they had seen something or witnessed something that they felt like was morally wrong. And again, this was all in the context of a combat deployment. So these kinds of morally injurious experiences have consequences for our mental health and for the topic of today's webinar. So there are numerous studies that have looked at moral injury with relation to some of the things that you see on the slide there, and including the study I was just talking about, where we see that moral injury is related to higher levels of depression. It's related to more PTSD symptomatology. It's related to greater levels of substance abuse, and importantly for today, it's related to higher levels of suicidality. The last piece of kind of research that I wanted to note as part of some of this moral injury research is from a study that was done about 15 years ago. So again, they weren't looking specifically at moral injury. What they were looking at, this was a sample of veterans seeking PTSD care from the VA. It was a study done up in New Haven by Fontana and Rosenheck, and they were looking at what motivates veterans with PTSD to turn to the VA for care. And what they found was that over and above PTSD symptomatology, in other words, having significant PTSD symptoms, re-experiencing symptoms, avoidance, nightmares, we can go down the list. More than that, more than a feeling of social isolation, veterans were motivated by a loss of meaning and purpose in life. And I think meaning, purpose, morality, sense of identity, a lot of these things hang together for many individuals. And so from a VA perspective, a lot of the work that we've tried to do has focused on this. How can we make sure that our VA system is meeting the needs of the veterans who are coming to us, seeking care and coming with these needs? Next slide. So this is my last slide that I will leave you with, and then I'll turn it back over to Harold and to Joe. But I wanted to say just a little bit about some emerging care approaches. This construct of moral injury, as I've said, has not been around all that long. So there's lots of work going on in this area and lots of work that needs to continue to be done. One of the things that we have fostered out of our office is something that we've termed a moral injury dynamic diffusion network. What we've done as part of this is we've brought together teams of mental health professionals and chaplains who are co-leading moral injury groups at a number of different locations across the VA. So that web link there takes you to learn more about those sites. The folks that we brought together by no means are the only places where some of this work is going on, but we wanted to bring these people together to share their practices, to continue to refine and iterate what they're doing, to measure the outcomes of what they're doing, and from that to then share some of their work with other locations across VA. Importantly, for the folks on this call, there are moral injury groups that are offered at the Durham VA healthcare system. So if that's something that's of interest to you, I don't personally offer those groups, but we absolutely know the folks who do that. Feel free to send an email to the link there, or the email address there at the bottom of this slide, if that's something that may be of interest, and we can try to facilitate some of those connections. There are a number of psychotherapies, both new and existing, that are being adapted in different ways to look at moral injury. Joe Currier, Kent Drescher, and myself co-edited a book last year addressing moral injury in clinical practice, where we had a bunch of leaders of different psychotherapies write about how those could apply to moral injury. So if people are thinking about this and attempting to address it, we need to continue to research it and see what works. We just earlier this morning, that work I was just talking about with the Dynamic Diffusion Network, we looked at what are some of the core principles that apply across all of these groups that mental health providers and chaplains are co-leading. And you know, what do they share? What are the things in common, and what might that tell us about how we should provide care for moral injury? So we just resubmitted a manuscript on that topic earlier this morning. Those are things going on in healthcare. I'm in healthcare. I think it's important. It's not the end of the road. That's the really cool thing about the governor's work group and the you know, work and the commitments of the organizations that come together as part of this. Community engagement is critical from lots of different angles. One little piece of that our program has focused on has been engaging faith communities. So that's the last address here on this slide, website on this slide, takes you to a series of 4 different videos that we developed for use in faith community small groups to encourage these faith communities to think about how they can become places of welcome and belonging for veterans and for individuals with mental health struggles. Moral injury is one of the specific things that's focused on in these 4 videos. We know, again, going back to some of the things that Nicole was just saying in terms of, you know, what's the remedy? I hesitate to use that language, but if we could write a script for community or for belonging, that is so important and life-giving for people. We know that intuitively. Any of us who just reflect on that in our own lives, we absolutely know it from the research as well. And so bringing together those kind of communities and the way that the governor's work group does some of this sort of work, I think is absolutely critical for veterans, including veterans who are suffering from moral injury. With that, I will turn it back over to Dr. Kudler.
Thank you, Jason. And you know, I want the audience to be sure that they know that the national impact that the work that you and Keith Metter have been doing has had, how much this is valued in VA central office, and how creative and in some ways radical it is to bring in faith leaders, community leaders. We know that, frankly, veterans are much more likely to speak to a faith leader about their combat experience than they are to a mental health professional. And you were able to bring those conversations together, and this continues to grow. I was also thinking about you and Nicole's talk. You're talking Nicole's, and I asked myself, is moral injury a trauma? Developmental psychologists have demonstrated very clearly that even very young children, younger than we think about, would have a very clear sense when something isn't fair and respond to it very clearly. And then, you quoted Jonathan Shea. One of the ways Jonathan Shea has talked about moral injury is the violation, especially by an admired leader, of what's right. So couldn't so many of the adverse childhood events, especially at the hands of parents who are either abusive or neglectful, and neglect can be even more injurious than abuse, be understood as moral injuries as well, and really weave all this together?
Oh, I think you're spot on, Harold. And to take that just a step further, I was thinking the same thing listening to Nicole, that the importance of the adverse childhood events, these ACEs, and we know that a number of individuals entering the military do bring these adverse childhood experiences with them into the military. For many, just imagine if that's your experience, you go into the military, perhaps you're finding a place of community, of people you can trust. I think for many individuals, the military is a very healthy and restorative place in that way. And we know that from some of the suicide data going back, we have to go back a little further than the last 20 years, but historically being in the military was actually a protective factor against suicide. And I think that's because of some of these things, community. Now, if you end up being betrayed by someone in the military, and you already have had one of those adverse childhood experiences, these things can compound, right? So I think you're pointing exactly to some of the importance and the challenges that can be faced here. I did have this slide in there. So this video series is also out there. Our office has an upstream suicide prevention 3-part series. If folks are interested in that, encourage you to check it out. And the last thing I'll say is, Harold, we have had a national impact, and I so appreciate the work when you were head of mental health for VA, and folks like you who have had a public health vision, because it's made a space within VA for us to be able to do this kind of work. So thank you for that. Well,
thanks, Jason. Thank you. I did no more than keep the ball rolling. And speaking of keeping the ball rolling, I want to bring us to Joe Hazel of the Veterans Life Center and talk about working in real time in people's lives in a community and building community. It's what Joe and the Veterans Life Center are doing. So let me step back and let him take over this space. And then we're going to have some maybe give and take among the panelists, and then hopefully give and take with the audience. And I believe the question and answer section is where, if people who are participating would like to put their ideas, their thoughts, their questions to the panelists, the question and answer section would be the ideal place. And I'll start taking a look at that. Joe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being here. And honestly, every presentation, especially from Mark Bellows, is what he's doing and getting the word out. That's exactly what I'm going to talk about today. And also for Jason, we do have moral injury here that I'm working with too right now. One thing I found out, that moral injury also brings about absolute unforgiveness. And I'm working on that aspect also. Also for Nicole, I just made a presentation to the group this morning about adverse childhood experiences and a relationship with resilience. How those play together, that it kind of complicates developing a good resilience in your life. And so that all fits. So everything is fit together. And I like to say that I appreciate everything that the VA is doing, everybody that's presenting, the governor's working group that I've known for a little while. I think that you're doing a terrific job. And what I'm here to talk about today is kind of the other side, looking at the family picture. And this first slide is just a very short video about trauma begets trauma. So traumatized veteran comes home. The family is not aware of resources. The veteran is not aware of resources. So then the family is traumatized. Then the veteran has to leave home. The veterans now at risk for homelessness, the possibility of suicide. Spouse and family are at risk for depression and maybe suicide. Project Sanctuary said there's 123 spouses that succumbed to suicide in 2017. So next slide. So all these resources, I started looking, I got to at least 100, a little over 100 resources that are available to family and veterans that's out there, but they know very little about it coming home that I've heard. If they are informed, they may forget it, they may not want to know it or whatever, and I know that's true too. But residents here at the VLC report that they've received no information concerning home reintegration. The families have not received any. And I've heard this from a couple of veterans here. My family doesn't understand my PTSD. I had to leave the house. I was living in my vehicle, using alcohol and drugs. Before finding VLC, my next step may have been a gun to my head or from someone else. So the programs that are available may not solve all the problems of returning veterans with all of these issues, but we can do better. And I think that's what Mark was talking about earlier, about doing better to get this word out. So we have so many that we could take advantage of. One family at a time, we can get better of helping them not only to be aware, but to be the urgency of them to look at some of these things when they come back. I think it's troublesome when I hear from so many that have absolutely no idea what kind of services are available until the implosion happens. And then they may not want to talk to anybody or get any help from there. One of these are right now in the process of divorce. The other one is reunifying with his family, which is a good thing, but they both had some traumatic issues at home and abroad. Next slide. I just put together a few because I couldn't put over 100 on here. The VA has a tremendous amount of things that's available. The Military Families Guide from the Governor's Working Group. Coaching into Care, where families can be the caretaker and help a person get into care. Supportive and Family Education, 18 sessions. And then there's the Operation Enduring Families. It's 5 sessions taken from the SAFE program manual, which is 91 pages long. So we have these things available. Operation Project Sanctuary, I'm going to talk about on the next slide. Project Sanctuary, I just learned as my research into looking at some of these, was organized and founded by Hazel Early in 2007. I hope I pronounced that right. While working as a registered nurse, she saw that no organization was helping the family as a unit. So she found the organization with the principle that when one person serves, the whole family serves. And the best way to support the troops, veteran or active, was to create an organization for supporting the entire family. Even here in North Carolina in Black Mountain, they have 3 retreats that are free of charge, more or less, in January, April, and August. And from their questions of what is the cost, you provide a check for $100. If you show up, they give you the check back, and everything else is paid for. I haven't heard of any other programs like this. It started in Colorado. And it got my attention when she said, when one family served, they all served. I'm a Vietnam veteran. And fortunately, I was a career person when I left for the last time and had the help I needed from my squadron and from my flight surgeon and others and the chaplains that I got. So as the spiritual advisor and the family advisor here, we do not provide direct therapy, so to speak. So as an advisor, we get them connected, and I have really helped people get connected, some with local resources in the churches in the local area, some who have gone on to seek help from the VA that never had before, and to help them understand that there is help available. But a lot of times, some would not take the time to look it up or not take the time to find out, coming home thinking everything's going to be okay. I certainly thought that coming back from Vietnam. I'm so happy to be home. It's going to be okay. Well, it took it a long time to be okay. So I think that as we look at what's available, we have resources. We have had resources, but we need somehow to make it more urgent. And I don't know how to do that. I'll be willing to work with Mark or anyone else that I can help to do that, especially with the spiritual community, how I can increase their awareness. I'm planning on speaking with churches in Raleigh and STEM and Creedmoor and Butner within the next quarter to talk about what we do here and what's available, and talk about what's available with the VA and other resources. But it's just sad to hear that those things are there and they weren't utilized because of their not wanting to, or because they didn't know about it. So any help that we can offer, anything that we can do. So the last slide. So there are many resources everywhere. There's resources, yet families still struggle. Awareness of these programs is somehow being overlooked by many veterans and their families. So I believe that the family does matter, and I think everybody believes that. However, this 20-year war that has ended has proven more than ever that war is hell and was being fought on a volunteer service, which is different than any others. And due to 9/11, we know in the modern media that families are more involved in world events and battlegrounds than ever before. But what's not advertised or covered adequately is how to reintegrate as a family when the service member comes home. So I think we can do better. I think I can do better. The families deserve it. The veterans deserve it. So this is not, I don't want anybody to take the idea that this is an expose on anybody. We're all wanting to get the help out there. We all want to make to help the families to reintegrate and not to implode and wind up on the street. The one veteran that I talked to, he was absolutely ready to put the gun to his head. And I don't remember how he found out about VLC, but I don't remember how he discovered it. But he came in and he's been here since that time. It's been several weeks now. So I want to leave you with the idea that we have the stuff that's available. We have the resources. We have the wonderful people who are developing resources. But maybe we can get better at media, better at the public or whatever with the resources that are available for the veterans. So that's all I have, and I really appreciate your time and all of your effort. I really do.
Well, thank you, Joe. And I want to start by thanking you for your service in Vietnam and for the service you're offering now.
Thank you, sir.
Well, and you know, I was thinking about what you were saying, and why don't people know, or why don't they reach out? You know, one of those age-old problems. My old chief of service, a Navy man, used to have this joke about this board of directors of a dog food company saying, and the chairman of the board says, "We make the best damn dog food in the whole world, and the damn dogs won't eat it."
Yeah.
There was something wrong with that. And you know, I've thought about all the high quality things that we do, and put it out there, and people have been asking for links here. But in thinking about that, I was thinking, I don't think it's a lack of getting the information all the time. Very often when people come back from war, they're hoping when they come home, as actually one of my colleagues at the Durham VA said when he came back from his Army Reserve service in Afghanistan early on. Well, we're all thinking about beer, sex, and pizza, and we figure if we get enough of all those and maybe some sleep, we'll be fine. So, you know,
right.
But I think it goes well past that. I think most people on this show know Gene Kelly, you know, from wonderful musicals. Mm-hmm. So Gene Kelly served in the Navy in World War II, and he helped write and direct and star in a Navy training film on, I think it's called Combat Irritability. He even got himself admitted incognito to a psychiatric ward in Philadelphia, a Navy psychiatric ward for combat veterans, so he could make it as realistic as possible. They eventually figured out who it was. Turns out his daughter is a child psychoanalyst, and recently she contacted me, this is a couple of years ago now. The Navy was archiving that film, and I'll get the link for it, and I'll try to get it in the chat if I ever stop talking, right? So what it shows is this guy says, I just got to go home to my family. I'll be all right, doc. Let me out of this place. Yeah. I'll be okay. He goes home to his family and he basically tears his family apart. Yeah. All of his struggles, the moral struggles, the PTSD, which are really evident in this World War II movie, you know, because Gene Kelly was a great observer of human nature, what made him a great actor. And he just soaked it up. He didn't need medical books. And veterans don't need medical books to tell them how to feel, right? Anyway, he tears his family to pieces until he kind of resolves his own issues with what happened, why he was one of the only survivors of his ship when it exploded during a combat engagement. You know, what's he doing alive when nobody else is? He didn't think he deserved it. He doesn't deserve this girlfriend who still loves him. He doesn't deserve these parents who are so nice. He doesn't deserve this life. And well, that's about as old as warfare, I think. In these recent wars, David Finkel wrote a book called Thank You for Your Service. He embedded with an army group an army unit in, I think in Iraq. And then he followed this family, basically lived in their basement on and off for a year and wrote about the year after they came home. They made a movie out of it. I have to say it wasn't a great movie, but it was true. And you know, and he's a great journalist. He's not a medical person either. He's just observing and writing down what he saw. And I got to meet the protagonist, the real sergeant this was based on. And basically this guy feels he doesn't deserve to be happy. He doesn't deserve a wife. He let his buddies down. He didn't stop the sniper from shooting his best friend in the head. And when he carried his best friend on his back down about 4 flights to get him to safety, he dropped his friend. The two of them fell down the last flight of stairs. I must have ruined his brain. I'm responsible. This is all me. The shot in the head was nothing. I dropped the guy and he fell on his head. These are the things that torture these guys when they get back, and they don't want to reach out for help because they don't think they deserve it. I'm just wondering how you and maybe Nicole and Jason might respond to that and where the conversation might go from there.
What was just shared really resonates with, you know, what I hear in sessions with veterans who are dealing with combat trauma and are dealing with a lot of survivor's guilt. And I really appreciated your presentation, Jason, too, on moral injury. And, you know, part of this is really understanding, I mean, many of them haven't even put into words. They're just like operating, living their life, for example, working really hard to make a difference, driven by, you know, this need to do something impactful, because, you know, out of remembrance for those they lost. And, you know, some of them feel guilty when they feel joy. In fact, can't even probably access that human experience of delight and joy because somehow it's dishonoring the ones that they lost. And so, you know, being able to, one thing that came up as I was listening to all of you was, and I think you, Joe, just kind of talking about trauma and, you know, its effects and how it's so hard to, there are some blocks, right? In why isn't the message being received? Like there's so many resources available. Why are people not flooding our doors to get the help that they need? And, like the retreat that you're offering families. Wow, what an incredible experience to be outside, to relate and connect to others. We know how important relationships are, and yet trauma disrupts that part of our brain, really fragments that part that that is responsible for insight, right? Connecting some of these dots. In response to trauma, that fight flight system, we move away from the very sources that can actually replenish our cup or kind of revitalize us. So, there are no easy answers, but I think that, it starts honestly with such kind attention in a relationship where there's some trust and someone is willing to pay attention to their body, pay attention to what they need, pay attention of what they're getting or what they don't have, and starting that conversation. So I'll stop there, but those are a couple of things that just have come to mind.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, would so much agree with that, Nicole. And, I was mentioning we have been doing some work pulling out the core components of these various approaches to moral injury that are being used by, these Chaplain mental health co-leadership teams. And they're all doing groups. Within VA, sometimes the notion has been, well, groups are efficient. It's a way to see a lot of people. Okay. For moral injury, I think for a lot of the reasons you just brought up, Nicole, some of the things that need to be addressed can really only optimally be addressed with a group of other veterans. I definitely believe in the work that, we can do individually as counselors and as care providers. But it kind of heralds example of, oh, it's my fault. I dropped this guy on his head, and that's why he can't. There's so much that a doctor or a counselor can do, and then there's a veteran, there's somebody else who's been there, and if you can share that with a veteran, somebody else who's been there, and there can be a little bit of a pushback or a corrective, or that's there's a power in that, and there's an invitation, back into belonging and being part of a community that I think is just so important and needed for a lot of folks.
And I don't want to imply that every veteran has this concern, but when they do have this concern, it stops them in their tracks.
Yes.
Some of the most successful interventions I've really heard about can happen in, have happened in like special forces groups where you've got these guys who there's a natural trust. They've done training together. It's so hard to raise your hand and say, hey, I need help. And yet in these groups, they've become peers, peer supports to each other, and then they have direct access to formal supports. I am curious, I'm so grateful the VA is dedicating research and energy to this area, because I think there still needs to be connection between the VA and the groups that occur there and then in the community. Mm-hmm. And there were groups, Ed Tick's work, with Vietnam veterans that you kind of referenced, and some other, work has been done in community, but I just haven't seen that many great examples like myself in community. And I do invite players like, Joe, you're doing great work within within the Veterans Life Center. And then, what are those connections to community? I think there's a great opportunity. We know people are greater risk in transition from higher levels of care to outpatient care, and how do we partner and create belonging, especially for that shared experience is really important. And I don't know how you connect some of those dots.
I'm willing to learn. We'll try.
I want to pick up on a couple of themes here too. That, I mean, Harold, I think it's so important what you just said of this is not every veteran's story, and it's not. Working in a healthcare system and being a psychologist, we tend to focus on what goes wrong and how can we intervene when things go, you know, that's kind of our role. That's kind of our job. But, you know, even just being on this call and sort of, you know, hearing the veterans and Jeff and Paul and Victor, you know, it's like clearly for so many, the military is such a sense of meaning and purpose and commitment and community, and all of that is in there with this. And I mentioned this sort of video series that we had for faith communities. We have a veteran in there who sort of talks about this experience. And I think it's, I guess the other piece I want to kind of tie in is like communities and the importance of a community. There are also, you know, I think things to be wary of sometimes, or to be mindful of when attempting to help veterans. So faith communities, for example, sometimes can have a particular narrative that they want veterans to fit into. You know, all veterans are heroes, or there are some faith communities that, you know, maybe lean a little more pacifist, and all veterans are victims, right? And so if you're a veteran, you come to this community, and we want to hear that story from you. We want you to kind of fit into that mold. And that's a problem. People need to be able to tell their stories. And one of the veterans, you know, in this video was talking about sort of his need to tell his experience in its fullness with sort of this moral injury experience alongside the pride that he had in serving his country. So it's these things aren't even mutually exclusive, right? It's not one or the other. You can be extremely proud and grateful for your military service, and it gave you so much, and there can be a morally injurious or a PTSD experience that's in there. So I just think that those are all things that I hear a number of folks pointing to that are important to keep in mind.
Well, you know, Jeff has asked me at some point to tell a brief story, and I'll share it here. So one of the things that happened while I was in Washington is I ended up being quoted on the front page, I think it was the Sunday New York Times, responding to a different reporter who was embedded with a Marine unit. And this reporter had a series of stories about this unit, saying this unit has a very high rate of suicide, and DOD and the VA aren't doing anything about it. And what I was quoted saying is responding to the point. I was trying to explain that, you know, the Marine Corps and the Department of Defense has no way of knowing if someone dies by suicide after they leave the military. There's no automatic reporting back to them about that, except, you know, maybe somebody in the unit decides to tell them. And the VA doesn't really know which unit you served in. So we don't have a way of kind of saying, well, we have a lot of veterans and they're in this unit and they died by suicide. So the problem is that nobody really has that to begin to pull together the pattern of it. And well, I'll tell you, the way I still looked quoted in the New York Times, I felt like an idiot. I felt like basically I was saying it's not our problem. And whether or not I felt guilty about that, I got a call that day, both from an admiral at Walter Reed, who was in charge for the military of suicide prevention for our region of the country, and a call from the Undersecretary for Veterans Health, saying, we're going to do something about it, and you're going to do it. You're going to be part of this, and we're doing this. So a year later, with the help of the Navy's Bureau of Medicine, BUMED, with the CDC, with the Public Health Service, with everybody the Marine Corps could throw into this, everybody the VA could throw into it, we generated a report that we gave back to the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps at the Pentagon and to the Secretary then of Veterans Affairs of what we learned looking at this Marine unit. And what we learned was there was no pattern we could discern at all, except that it wasn't just the entire regiment, it was certain units, subunits that had served during certain deployments but the single most common thread we had was, it was 3 o'clock in the morning, the veteran had been drinking, a wife or a girlfriend or a child slammed the screen door on their way out in anger, and there was a loaded weapon. That was the only pattern we could discern. But even with that, and I want to say what we did with that, not knowing what to do, the CDC said, we're done. We did the math, we're done. There's nothing else we can do. Nobody knew what to do about this. We were able to get Semper Fi, an organization created by Marines' wives, and I imagine a few husbands too. And the VA is not very good at giving people airplane tickets anywhere, not even its own staff sometimes. But Semper Fi paid for 30 members of these units from these squads to come to outside of, actually, we went down outside of Quantico. They all stayed in a hotel in Quantico, flew them from as far away as Guam, all over the US, and we brought these people together. One had an identical twin from that unit who died also of suicide a year before the day we met. And what they said was, you know, thank you for bringing us together. Thank you for telling us what you learned in your, you know, year-long study. Thank you for telling us all your highfalutin medical ideas. And they were very sweet, you know, but they're Marines. The one thing that we really liked in what you told us was that you train veterans to be peer support specialists. Would you train us? We're 30 guys. Would you train us to be peer support specialists? And in fact, Semper Fi paid for them to do that, but the VA did supply the training. We put it all together. And a number of those guys, I believe now about 50 of them, not just the group from the first group, are now peer support specialists for their unit. And they have a network within that unit that they call each other. And when people, even if people don't call, if nobody heard from them in a while, these peer support specialists reach out to members of the unit that nobody's heard from for a while and say, how you doing? And the peer support specialists not only know all about being a member of that unit, and they have entree to things I will never hear as a psychiatrist, because they are Marines, members of that unit who have been where they've been. But they know how to connect them to people like me when I'm the right person, or people like Nicole, or people like Jason, or people like Joe. And this, I think, is the future. It isn't easy. We did it in this hothouse environment because the New York Times embarrassed the VA and the Department of Defense. You know, thank God for a free press, right? I think this is part of the answer, but I'd be interested in what other people think about that story, what they might add to my understanding of what worked and what didn't work.
I love that story. And I know that I've had several conversations with people in this group about peer support training. And it just makes me think about, you know, what we know about, you know, parents, like what leads to optimal development. Well, number one, the parent needs to have that capacity to reflect on their own experiences so that they have choices, right, to how to show up with their child and not repeat trauma. So, you know, while in uniform, for example, I supported master resilience trainers. University of Pennsylvania had, you know, rolled out a program, and the Army trained, you know, thousands of MRTs. I think part of the success of that model, I hear, is that peer support training is absolutely designed to, it's easier to say, I'm going to help somebody else than it is to help ourselves. But it invites someone into that healing process through education and reflection, and they've started their own journey, and then they're a little further ahead. And in terms of their own healing, they're paying attention in a different way to their peers. And then they are also trained in the networks, right, that exist, because there has to be an evolution to, okay, I'm no longer in the military where everything's all around me. Like, how do I navigate this community? And by connecting with folks like us who do have a map, now we're getting better at like putting that actually on paper, because a lot of us still have too much in our heads, but where are all of these relational networks and how do we get people connected in a timely way? Beautiful. Thank you for sharing. I do think that needs to be the wave of the future. And it makes me think of the team of teams like model 2, where you have these liaisons between these special groups that bridge bridge separate groups, like they are and make those connections. So thank you for sharing.
Harold, your story made me think of a National Guard chaplain who's been a close partner for many years. And you said sort of the one thing you could discern from the data was it's 3 a.m. and just had some kind of crisis situation and access to a loaded weapon. This National Guard chaplain says, I've gotten plenty of 3 a.m. calls, but nobody ever calls me at 3 a.m. and says, "Hey chaps, can you explain this virgin birth thing?" I just can't wrap my mind around it, but I get plenty of calls of, "Hey chaps, my wife just left me. Hey chaps, my mom just died. Hey chaps, I can't take this anymore." Go down the list, right? And one of the things on the VA side, VA has this high risk list, right? You're high risk for suicide. And so we're careful to follow up with those veterans if you get on that list. We've had chaplains, so actually Chaplain Ryan Parker at the Durham VA instituted this practice initially, and then it spread elsewhere. So we've got a chaplain in Florida who was just sending us data this morning. It's been a year where he's been tracking. They as chaplains reach out to everybody who gets placed on this high risk list. And you think, well, gosh, the VA already has, they already have, we have our program, we have the list, we have the people who are reaching out. There's something about how people perceive a chaplain. It's not quite a peer support specialist in the same way, but it's not your doctor. It's not somebody who has to follow up with you to check the box so that they can say they followed up with you, right? It's somebody who, all right, you're checking in with me. It makes me, and we need, as Nicole and Harold, you're both saying, we need these peer support programs. We need people making those calls that someone feels like, oh, this is somebody who's calling because they care, not because we don't care as healthcare. Of course we care as healthcare professionals. It's just how that's heard, how it's perceived. We need these other levels of community folks, and we need people also who are going to pick up the phone at 3 a.m. right? Like, let's do stuff about the lethal means stuff, right? And access to that so the loaded weapon isn't available. But also, when this is happening at 3 a.m., Harold, like, do you have somebody in your speed dial before you pick that up? Is it these Marines that you guys trained? Or is it the chaplain, or who is it? So.
No, yeah. Thanks, Jason. I wonder, I know that a lot of people on this call are veterans, but for those who aren't, Joe, I was wondering if you could say a word about how a service member looks at a chaplain as opposed to looking at a psychiatrist or their commanding officer when it comes to having a problem. Oh, you're muted still, Joe.
I think, yes, sir. It's interesting how they would come into the office to talk about nothing. I like that. They'll come in and, just want to say hi or just, talk some small talk or whatever. Then they'll come in with something really serious. And then they may not, but somebody else sees something. So they say, you need to go see Joe. So then they'll come in. So it's a variety of things, but there is an attraction to, I would say, the seal of the confessional. They feel safe. They feel more safe. Now, not necessarily it's more safe than the director's office, but they feel more safe. And I let them know that it is a seal of confessional, that we do hold that dear, and that they're welcome anytime to talk about anything. So it's really interesting, all the things they come and talk about. Underneath, they're talking about something else. We always have to read between the lines. I love it. I love it. I love it.
It's a wonderful calling to have, and there's so much good you can do, and it fleshes out the opportunities. One more receptor site and a really good one, a really strong one. You remind me that early on in these wars, you know, we pumped up the combat stress control teams across the military. And the Marines did a great job with the sprint program, and it was really a Navy program with the Marines. The Army had combat stress control. Carl Castro, I think, was mentioned earlier, you know, was one of the leaders in that. If anybody could ever find where the Army buried its training, combat stress control training, for when you come home, it's his squeaky voice that says, bringing a loaded weapon on a picnic is a really bad idea. But the fact is that with the combat stress control team sounds, nobody wanted to come. Nobody was showing up in these lovely little tents with all the staff standing by to help you with your mental health problem. And so what they did is they said, well, we're going to get a lot of videos. We're going to get lots of cards. We're going to show movies. and you know, just if you're in the neighborhood, drop in, watch a movie, play some cards. And then people would come. And as you say, it wasn't in a spiritual setting so much, but people would come watch the movie and play cards and eventually maybe talk about something that mattered to them, because now they felt at home and they trusted the people there. And this is the challenge for us. We can have, again, the best dog food in the whole world, and the dogs won't eat it. Yeah. The best doctors, the best, you know, anything we want to be. But if we can't connect, and this too is one of the social determinants of health and suicide.
Right. I
agree. So I'm thinking about, I was on a combat stress control team. And so like these walkabouts, right, that you go out and do and connect with people. But in the community, these opportunities to volunteer, right, these opportunities that community partners provide for veterans to go to games, to hang out and get to know each other. There are veteran communities on Facebook and LinkedIn. I would say the combat stress control training too now is we have opportunities for mental health first aid, for question, persuade, refer, so we're connecting. The focus is on connecting. And as we're connecting around something, volunteering or something fun, when there is connection and we're building a relationship, that's when people, you know, start trusting us with parts of their story, and it'll come out in pieces, and we'll have the opportunity to invite them to a connection, a formal connection if that's needed. But sometimes just that connection is enough. They feel that is where that belonging starts. They feel connected. Their body starts responding to that connection. So thank you for reminding us of the combat stress control model.
I want to thank all of you. Go ahead.
There was a minister counselor who wrote a book called Connecting. And on the first page, he said, we don't need to train any more counselors. We need to just start talking to each other. And a lot of that's true.
Well, there you are. And I just want to thank all of you. I'm looking at the clock and it's 3:59. I know we're going to have to stop in a moment. I want to make sure that our hosts, Jeff and Crystal and the entire team, they don't have any instructions or information. I'll remind people that this whole thing has been recorded, so it can be accessed later. If you want to pick up on a link or an idea that you want to be sure of, I'll certainly offer to be available if I can ever help. But all I can say is thank you to a wonderful panel for a wonderful conversation.